Coming up on this episode,
there's the rising tide lifts all boats mindset, and I'm very much a proponent. While moving up the racecourse, a sailor has the opportunity to read and react to shifts. There are always wind shifts, no matter how small. And I think if you replace wind with market in that sentence, then you get a sense of how authors can test the waters of new opportunities using several short tacks rather than one larger work.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
hello Reflectives, and welcome to episode 116 of the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. This episode is a conversation with Maddie Dalrymple about her new collaborative book project. Maddie is the author of the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers and the Ann Kinear Suspense Novels. She's a member of Mystery Writers of America, Sisters in Crime, International Thriller Writers, and the Brandywine Valley Writers Group. She lives with her husband Wade, who is a musician and an awesome Rush fan, I might add, and their 3 lovable puppies in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is the setting for 2 of her Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. Maddie and I talk about her new venture into 2 new areas for her, nonfiction and collaboration. But before we get to that conversation, I want to share a few comments from recent episodes. Steve Mohan wrote in to me and gave me an interesting backstory to Kanban. I think I pronounced that right. This is the productivity tool mentioned in a previous episode by Amy Tassikata, who'd left that in a comment. Now, Steve, who I know is a writer, was a manufacturing engineer for more than 25 years, and he told me that he worked with Kanbans all the time. He said, a Kanban, in a manufacturing sense, is a signal. For example, we would size parts bins based on our daily rates of production, how many parts were needed per unit of production, and our supplier lead time. That way you never run out of parts, and you also don't have huge piles of inventory hanging around. Once a bin is emptied, it's triggered, which means it goes back to the supplier. This is the supplier's signal to make more parts. That's really cool. I like having the backstory to where a new technology's name comes from something out of a different industry. So thanks for that, Steve. And speaking of Amy, who prompted that response or that comment or that feedback, she also commented on episode 115, which was my interview with Adam Croft, and she said, thanks for the shout out. I enjoy them too. Awesome. She also said, referring to Adam's tagline for Her Last Tomorrow, I've heard that tagline so often, and it was fun to actually hear it from the person who wrote the book. Yeah, I was pretty pumped about that too myself, Amy, because I have heard that many, many times. Rarely have I actually heard it in the awesome voice of Adam Croft. Now, Mendy also commented on episode 115 with Adam Croft and said, the encouraging takeaway for me was that even authors with life-changing sales on a book still struggle with doubts and mediocre sales on other books. Logic knows this fact, but sometimes the heart believes everything is unicorn and rainbows for the successful authors, and everything they touch turns to gold. Mendy, that is so true. We often think those things, and I love it when a hugely successful author like Adam can come and talk about imposter syndrome and talk about not every single book is a lightning bestseller. So that is always great to see. I mean, there are good moves, there are bad moves, there are great things, there are not so great things as well. And it's really, really great when somebody can show up with the authenticity that Adam did and reveal that it's not all sunshine, rainbows, or unicorns and rainbows, as you said. Now, Mendy also said, P.S. Adam, thanks for creating small soundbite courses so much easier to tackle. And Mendy, I agree with you on that one. I'm also going to include links in this episode episode 116 is a reminder that Adam generously offered 50% off his courses. And there's plenty of courses. They're already affordable and short and easy to tackle, but why not 50% off with the coupon code STARK? And finally, a comment via email from Wade about my special episode 114, which was Thanks for the Inspiration, Neil Peart. Wade said, Neil has been an incredible inspiration to millions, and anyone who can be grieved like a family member by so many has lived a life in full. Thanks again for devoting an episode of your podcast to remembering Neil and for sharing your reflections in such an open, heartfelt, and honest way. Well, thank you, Wade. That was awesome. I thought that particular podcast was very self-indulgent and it was stuff I needed to do. I needed to share. I needed to mourn. I needed to reflect on the ways that Neil inspired me, and obviously the way that his work and his writings and himself, the way he touched me and touched my heart. So I'm glad that it meant something to you as well. Now, just a reminder that for episodes 113 and 115, yes, I'm talking to you, listener, still have a chance to win great prizes. Okay, so listen to those episodes to learn how, so I don't have to repeat myself. But you can get entered in a chance to win those great prizes. Now, the deadline is January 31st, 2020. So unless you're listening to this several weeks after the episode goes live, you still have some time. And hey, if you have a time machine, well, you always have time. Now, just a reminder that the awesome patrons of this podcast are automatically entered to win prizes. So either they'll be entered in the regular draw just for being a patron, or when available, I have a second prize just for patrons only to win. And you can learn more about how you can become a patron if you're so interested, and gain access to additional episodes and extra content for the show for as little as $1, $3, or $5 a month over at patreon.com/starkreflections. This podcast will, of course, always be free, but I want to say thank you to all the patrons for helping support my time in producing the show, and with extra funds going towards paying for cool prizes to give to this amazing, reflective community of creative writers. But the hosting fees for this show are covered by a corporate sponsor, and this episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices. On January 10, 2020, Findaway Voices announced promotional pricing for audiobooks. When you log into Findaway Voices, you'll notice a new marketing link in your sidebar. On this page, you'll be able to submit a promotion request via active promotions, scheduled promotions, and past promotions. The retailers that currently support promotional pricing are Apple Books and Chirp, but I suspect there's going to be more coming. Apple Books and Chirp are just the leaders right now. You may set your price as low as free, but of course some retailers may require a 99-cent minimum price point, at which point if you submitted free, Findaway Voices would let you know that it's going to be 99 cents at that particular retailer, and of course pay you accordingly as the promotion happens and you sell units. Now, this is yet another great cutting-edge feature from the good folks at Findaway Voices, and to learn how you can find your way into the audiobook world, yes, I did that pun, yes, I did it. But the way that you can find your way into the audiobook world for creation and or distribution of your audiobook, check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. Now, I'm going to skip my personal update this week because this conversation is long. It's almost a full hour. And as well because there is something personal in this week's conversation. Yes, that's a teaser. And this was less of an interview, but more of a chat between me and Maddie. And this interview is also going to appear in the Indie Author podcast. So it's a conversation between the two of us. And without further ado, let's move on to that conversation. Hello, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre from the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast.
Hi, and this is Maddie Dalrymple from the Indie Author podcast.
We're going to share right now our background in terms of how we both got into writing.
So I am the author of the Ann Kinear Suspense Novels, The Sense of Death and the Sense of Reckoning, and the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, Rock, Paper, Scissors, Snakes and Ladders, and The Iron Ring. And perhaps even more applicable for the topic of this podcast, I am also the author of the Ann Kinear Suspense Shorts. And in addition to that, I have a nonfiction platform called The Indie Author, and I speak, consult, podcast on topics related to writing and publishing.
Excellent. And when did you first get into writing?
I published my first book in 2013. That took me 2.5 years, which was somewhat inefficient, and I've gotten a little more efficient every year since then. Last year, I actually finally left my corporate job, so I'm being able to focus on my true loves, which are fiction writing and delving into the world of publishing full-time now.
Excellent, excellent.
And how about your background, Mark?
My very first short story was published in 1992, which is, I guess, the same year that I first became a bookseller, first got into the bookselling industry, because I realized with a degree in English language and literature, there wasn't much else I could do other than getting a part-time job as a bookseller. And that was I got bit by the book bug. And then I also started working on selling short stories is where I actually got started. And back in the day, the going advice was sell some stories, build a name for yourself, and then maybe once you've sold enough stories and you have a track record, maybe an agent or editor will be interested in your book. But what I did is I ended up publishing my first book, self-publishing my first book in 2004, which was a collection of short stories, which had mostly previously been published in small press magazines. So my entry into self-publishing happened that early, but it's fascinating. I find that I started off with short fiction, was building myself a short fiction. My very first self-published book was short fiction. I mean, just last week, I self-published another collection of short fiction, and you and I have connected via this short fiction, which is a really exciting project. Are we ready to reveal what this project is, or are we going to still tease people?
Well, maybe we can share the story of how it came to be, and then the punchline will be what the culmination of all that communication was.
I love that. And since I'm old and can't remember things, Maddie, how did this come to be?
Well, I had the Ann Kinear Suspense shorts, which are a series of suspense short stories based on the characters from my Ann Kinear Suspense novels, and I had published those as standalone ebooks. And I was really looking for what else I could do with those, what opportunities they afforded to me. And I believe in one of your episodes of the Stark Reflections podcast, you had mentioned something about short fiction. And as a patron of the podcast, I sent you a note and I said, "Oh, I have all these questions about my short fiction, what I can do with it. Would you be willing to devote an episode to it?" Which you kindly did. I believe it was titled the 13 Ideas for What You Can Do with Your Short Fiction. And
lucky
that
number.
Podcast, yes, the lucky baker's dozen of things to do with your short fiction. And that episode, as all the episodes are, but that one was so chock full of great information that I then sent you a follow-up note and I said, would you be interested in co-authoring a book that expands on that topic? And I will let you give the punchline of what that ended in.
No, I want to tease it out a little bit more because I'm just
okay.
Going to be a teaser kind of guy. So the question I want to ask is, now I have collaborated on books before, and I'm wondering, have you ever collaborated on a book before?
I have not, and I never thought I would.
Really?
Why
was that?
Well, at the time I was thinking mainly of fiction, and I would hear stories from people who were collaborating on fictional work, and more power to them, but I just don't think I could do it. I mean, I chose the indie route because control is very important to me, and I still can't imagine giving that up for a fictional work, but I was also very interested in expanding my presence in the nonfiction world, writing and speaking and so on independent publishing, and recognizing that you had this fantastic background and fantastic contacts, and that you were so amenable to the idea of co-authoring. I kind of rethought it on the nonfiction side, and I just have to say it's been a fantastic experience.
All right. And we've already narrowed it down because I was going to tease out and was like, did they write short fiction together? What did they do in the same universe? What was going on? So we have revealed that it's nonfiction that we're writing.
Yep.
Or that we have written, I should say, because
That we have written.
the book is actually up for pre-order as we record this. And we're recording this on, Monday, January 20th, right? And the book's been up for pre-order for, I think we snuck it in a week ago.
Yes,
Something like
just
that.
about a week ago.
A week ago. Are we ready to reveal the name of the book and when the release date is? Or do we want to keep teasing it out? Because I just love doing that.
I think we've teased enough.
All right. Okay.
Let's not torment them too much longer.
Okay. So the book is co-authored by Maddie Dalrymple and Mark Lefebvre, correct?
Correct.
Got that part right. The book's
You
release date is February
4th.
2020.
Yeah.
It's up for pre-order on all the platforms. Pretty much every retailer out there that you can get an ebook on. And it's already starting to appear in some of the library systems from what I've been able to see.
Yes.
Cool. So you can request it at your favorite library, right? Support your local library. Support us
Absolutely.
by getting our book or requesting it at the library. And hang
Yep.
on, I have a cat that's trapped in a room, so I'll be right back.
Okay.
I should have known. I checked to see just before the meeting if she was trapped in the room, and she was nowhere to be found. Of course, the minute I start recording, she starts scratching on the door.
Then it becomes an emergency.
That is right. But I just did that just to tease it out a little bit longer, didn't I? That's probably what I was doing.
You're cruel.
Yes.
Cruel.
So the book is called?
The book is called Taking the Short Tack, Creating Income and Connecting with Readers Using Short Fiction.
Awesome. And the publishing imprint that is being used for this book is called?
It's William Kingsfield Publishers, which is my imprint. William Kingsfield was the pen name that my father used. My father was a short story writer, and he got some books published back in the 50s in magazines like Collier's and Cosmopolitan, and then turned his attention to novels, and it turned out that he was much more of a short story guy than a novel guy. But he wrote under the name William Kingsfield, and William Kingsfield Publishers is my homage to my father for inspiring me to be a writer.
That is phenomenal. I love that. And I don't even think we've spoken about that before.
No.
Or it might have been briefly mentioned, but I love the fact that you're using the imprint as an homage to somebody whose passion was short fiction. This is wonderful. There's this wonderful subtext that most people are never going to know in that imprint, but that's really, really cool. I love that.
Thank you.
So you reached out to me, and I mean, initially when you sent me the note and said, "Would you do the podcast episode?" I thought, okay, that's cool, but I was like, I am leery about episodes where it's just me rambling on and on and on. I love when I'm in a conversation with someone because I just feel like, oh, there's enough of me. Let's get some other voices in here. But I wanted to be able to put something together that I thought might be beneficial, like looking at the different options, right? Traditional publishing, self-publishing, what are the choices? I mean, again, when I first started, there wasn't a choice. I mean, there was. I could have, mimeographed short fiction, stapled it together and sold it for 5 cents, taken my little wagon down the street and tried to sell it to all the neighbors.
And you didn't do that? That sounds exactly like the kind of thing Little Mark would have done.
Well, Little Mark did do that. Little Mark did. I actually have to go back and explain that I was very much a DIY guy. So I wanted to be, we actually did have foolscap mimeographed long sheets of paper, the newspaper, the high school newspaper. So this is in the 80s, right? So a long, long time ago. And it would be a quarterly. So it would only come out 4 times a year. It was this giant newspaper. And I joined the newspaper in grade 9 because I was so excited because I wanted to send in my jokes and my articles and then the little cartoon sketches. And it wasn't really a newspaper because it was quarterly. I guess it was more like a magazine when you think about it, because news is like, oh yeah, and the basketball team lost last week. Like, 2 months later, it's published. So, not the Twitter news cycle that we have now. But I ended up, I think it was in grade 12, I ran to become the editor, and then it's voted, right? You go to the meeting and you get voted in as editor, and somebody else got voted in as editor, but she didn't do anything. And we were just kind of, the newspaper club is waiting for direction from the leader, our new esteemed leader. And a good buddy of mine who's a computer nerd. So you got to remember, this is like on Commodore 64s. I think the Amiga computer might have been out by then. We were using PET computers in the schools, like the big, green screen, giant box thingies.
Yeah.
And he had this software that looked like a newspaper layout, and the graphics, you couldn't upload images, you would just upload and it would be graphics. So there was an article that I had called Marky's Corner, and it was just like an opinion piece. This is me being funny and riffing on something, or quoting Rush lyrics and doing all kinds of whatever that I wanted to do as my column. I just go write about whatever I feel like. And so it was even like a computer generalized graphic of me. Now I had a beard when I was in high school, so I had the beard and I had big giant hair, and glasses. So caricature is pretty easy when you're bald and have certain facial features. It's easy to do that. And so what we did is Greg and I decided he was the tech behind it. We changed it from a mimeographed a newspaper that had to be supported by the student council because it didn't fund itself, because the cost to produce it was higher than the money that when you bought it for 5 cents each or 10 cents each or whatever. So what I did is I went to the student council. I said, I'm starting a new newspaper. And you haven't, the other newspaper hasn't happened, like you normally pay them X amount per quarter. I said, just give me $100. That's all I need to start up. I went, got the money. We did the computerized. There were no photocopiers in the town we lived in. No photocopiers at all. So you had to go into Sudbury, which is a 45-minute drive. So the English teacher, Mr. Furman, who was the support of that, Greg and I went, we produced a test sample. We posted it all over the school saying, first issue coming, end of September. Mr. Furman went into like I guess the equivalent of a Kinko's back then or whatever, if he was speaking and went in and did the photocopies, and it cost whatever. And we had just enough money to produce all of the issues. I mean, obviously nobody got paid for the newspaper. It was all like volunteer stuff. And we released that issue, and I increased the cost to 25 cents. And then the money we made back funded the next issue in it. And we did it monthly. So I've very much always been DIY. And I just kind of, and again, it was just kind of like, yeah, you're not going to run the newspaper. I'm starting my own. I'm going to do the same sort of thing. I don't know why I got on that sidetrack, but I think that's what I admired when I heard from you, is you wanted to learn this stuff. So you asked for it, right? And
Yep.
If you don't ask, sometimes you don't get, right? Because
Exactly.
people don't know that you want it. And then you came back and said, hey, I had this really cool idea. Let's do this. And initially, especially in a DIY environment, it's like, well, you kind of go, well, who am I to do this? Well, I already did an episode on it and I've lived this, and you've also done it too. So why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that the other thing that turned out to be really beneficial that I didn't appreciate as much when we started, but really appreciated as we were working through it, is that we brought really two pretty different perspectives to how to get our short fiction out there. So you had this great background in more the traditional market, approaches to getting to the publications that were looking for short fiction, tips about how networking can help do that. And I had come from the completely indie publishing background of having published all my short stories as standalone ebooks on the retail platforms. And I think it will be a big benefit for the readers of the book to be able to get both those perspectives.
Yeah, because I think it's balanced in that way. The other thing that I'm always curious about, because I've collaborated numerous different ways, is the way we collaborated and how we communicated. So some of the tools we used were Google Docs, like a shared drive.
Yep.
Dropbox.
Yep.
And then I think Dropbox was beneficial because you could open the document in Word and edit it, and it was saved to that folder. So if you went and saw it 5 minutes later and I just made a change, you could see it. It wasn't, I mean, we did email stuff back and forth as well, but that way we always had a place to go, right?
Yeah, I think having the shared sources was key, because it did avoid that version control nightmare of trying to maintain things by emailing them back and forth. I think that Dropbox ended up working pretty well because in most cases, each of us was the primary editor of each document. So I was editing the action items list, and I think it was convenient that you had access to that to read. And then,
Yeah.
there were documents that you were editing that I had access to read. It was a little awkward when we would both start going into documents and trying to edit them. And then
Same time, yeah.
yeah, conflicts would occur. So in that case, Google Docs had its benefits in that way, but it was more awkward because you couldn't, at least I couldn't figure out how to use some of the standard Microsoft Office type functionality like track changes and things like that. So, it took a little bit of experimentation to find the best way to go about that.
And so the other thing that I thought was very valuable and useful for me was an eye-opening exercise to see how somebody who's actually organized and does like project management stuff actually completes a project. Because as a pantser in terms of my fiction writing, where I'm a discovery writer, and I just love to just go, well, as I write the scene, I'll figure things out. And yeah, of course, things come up and you make notes and you know what's going to happen. But how am I going to get there? What's going to happen? How are the characters going to make these decisions? And are they going to change my mind? That for me is the thrill and joy of writing. So even when I'm doing a nonfiction book, I do usually high level. Here are going to be the chapters. Here are the points I need to cover. And then sometimes the chapters kind of take a mind of their own. I mean, two of the books I've written in my Stark Publishing Solutions series were supposed to be chapters in another book that just kind of got out of hand. It's like, well, it's already got 20,000 words. I guess it's more than just a chapter. But you brought this discipline and organization to my world of writing that even in my former collaborations, it was never that organized, right? When I've done, so previous collaborations that I've done have been nonfiction books on ghost stories, right? So true ghost stories. And we've used Google Docs and other spreadsheets to say, okay, here are the stories we think we're going to want to tell. Here are the locations. And then we just decide, okay, you're going to do this. I'm going to do this. You're going to do this. I'm going to do this. And then sometimes we flip them. Sometimes Shana, for example, my last co-author, maybe she thought she was going to do this because she was going to go on the ghost walk. And then she goes, no, that's more your cup of tea. I think you would like it more. or whatever. And so that's how those collaborations worked. Or even sometimes we thought we would write a chapter about this haunted house or whatever, but we couldn't find enough background. So it's kind of, so that was the extent of my use of spreadsheets was, what are you doing? What am I doing? Is this done? What's the estimated word count? What did it end up being? Has the other person kind of proofread it before we compile it to send to the editor? And I always did all the compiling. I always took all the stories and then I did all the formatting and then sent it off. In this particular case, for me, it was my first time stepping back and saying, okay, Maddie's controlling all of this and she's putting everything in order. And I'm assisting in that your outline was so detailed and so comprehensive. It scares me to be that organized, right? It's like, how do you know this early on? That's what it's going to be. So I'm curious, did you find it a challenge to work with some scatterbrain like me for this project?
No, I think, again, it worked out really well because we're bringing very different perspectives and approaches. And I came at this after having had several decades of experience as a project manager. And so my first tendency in all circumstances is to make a spreadsheet. And I'm seeing we could have like a collaborative article about collaboration out of this conversation.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think we do need to write one on collaborating with the yin and yang of collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we had the action items spreadsheet. Yeah. With all the things that had to be done and assigned names and dates. And we had the promotion spreadsheet that listed all the places where we wanted to promote taking the short tack. And we had, various versions of the actual manuscript. And that's just how I process things, is to get it all down on electronic paper. And the other thing that I think was very interesting and would merit more a deep dive of looking into is that when I went into this, I didn't know what approach was going to be most successful. I had never done a collaboration of this nature before. And when we first started out, I thought, well, I'll write what I know, and then I'll interview Mark and write what I find out from him. And then I would send it to you basically for a review. Right. But what we evolved to, and I thought worked out very well for me, and I hope worked out very well for you, is that I would draft a section and send it to you, and then you would actually do a lot of the writing. So it wasn't like I was having to extract the information and put it together. You would send me, half of the chapter, a quarter of the chapter, 3/4 of the chapter, whatever it might be. In some cases, entire chapters, because you were writing about topics that I myself didn't have experience in. And then my work became more taking what I had put together and making it sound consistent from a stylistic point of view. So you didn't get any kind of awkward jumping back and forth about, oh, person A must have written this and person B must have written this.
Yeah, try to be a little bit more generic in that approach, right?
Right. And I was using Vellum, or I was using Scrivener, I'm sorry, for the initial drafting of it until we got to the point where we needed to format it for the different platforms. And so I was really just slotting in whenever there was a topic. We want one on anthologies. We want one on serials. We want one on a reader funnel. We want one on reader magnet. And then I could move them around. And in fact, I think when we started out, I didn't even have a clear sense that the two themes were going to be creating income and connecting with readers. But it sort of evolved quickly over time that those were the two big chunks of information. And so in Scrivener, I could easily create a section for creating income, create a section for connecting with readers, and move the chapters into the appropriate sections. And this all happened pretty quickly because this all started in October. I think that the podcast was in October, or at least we agreed on the approach for doing the co-authored book in October. At the time, I had speculated, well, I want to try to get this out by the end of first quarter of 2020. You beat that by almost 2 months.
Yeah.
So I think it worked really well. And I think that, for a future collaboration, and I already have an idea, if we ever want to do a future collaboration, it would be even more smooth because we've gotten past that learning each other's styles. Right. And I also want to say as a pantser, I appreciate that you were so amenable to my spreadsheets and the approach we were using. So that made it very easy for me.
Well, I mean, because I don't have that natural inclination to do the steps and document it and timeline and Gantt charts. And I mean, I've done that but I've always, when I've been in charge, I've always made sure that there is a project manager type person to keep that, because I can't. So recognizing that was valuable to me, but also I know I would never do that. And so I loved the fact that you were always on top of things. You were always at highlighting the things that hadn't been answered, keeping track of the estimated deadlines and stuff. And I honestly think that if it weren't for that, we probably wouldn't have gotten as far as we got so quickly. I mean, the other thing too that was going on is I wrote, edited, and published 2 books in the time we were working on this, right? But one other nonfiction book. And that other nonfiction book was very much and it was based on podcast episodes as well. It was kind of like, the same. I took the same approach, except I had no other than setting a pub date and knowing what I had to get done in terms of, okay, I need to get in. I had to split it to send to my editor before the book was even done. So it was being edited in pieces so that when it finally came back, it was just because I didn't have a co-author, I didn't have to be as organized. I didn't have to communicate anything to anyone except my editor. So that was beneficial. And I did the cover design myself, right? In this particular project, the cover design was commissioned, and you commissioned a cover designer for that. How was that process, and how did that work? Because it was designed, I think, how far were we done the book before the cover was designed? I'm trying to remember.
Well, we were pretty far in before we came up with a name, and maybe when we get into more of the meat of the book rather than the collaboration, we can talk about where the short tack came from. But the short version is that in my writing about independent publishing and writing, I love the nautical analogy. There's just no aspect of writing or publishing that I've not found a great analogy in the nautical world too. And so I wanted a title that would reflect that for our book. And we can talk a little bit later about what taking the short tack means, but it's a sailing term. And so I sent my book cover designer, Lance Buckley, who had done some work for me earlier on creating large print covers for the Ann Kinear Suspense Novels and the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. I had gone through Unsplash, which is my favorite resource for free images, and I had found a picture of a sailboat taken from inside the sailboat and looking forward. And what I liked about it was that it didn't hit you in the face with sailboat. It was very sort of elemental. You could see a couple of the lines and you could see part of the sail. And I sent that to Lance, and I kind of mocked up a cover, and I said, I'm not suggesting that you reproduce this because I recognize this is very amateurish looking, but what I like about this is it's kind of referencing sailing without hitting you in the face with it, without making it look like it's going to be a sailing book. Yeah, it was subtle. And so Lance worked on that, and he sent me back a version that was actually based, I think, on sort of a stylized version of that photograph. And I love the overall design. My only concern was that it was not that the idea of it being the topic being short fiction wasn't immediately clear from the cover, and so we went back on a few more iterations and very quickly came up with the cover. So that was a really fun experience to be working with a professional on that.
So that's a good segue into the nautical elements. And I mean, when you said that, and I know we've talked about it before, but when you said it, I was reminded of a rising tide floats all boats, or whatever that, which I never even was like, oh my God, that's a nautical thing. And that's why authors help each other. And that's why they collaborate, and that's why they share. And that's why they're so giving of their time, because it's like, if I help other people be successful, it's not taking anything away from me. Right. So that's a perfect tie-in for that too.
That's a phrase I use a lot when I'm talking with audiences about writing or publishing, that there are really two mindsets in the author community. There's the zero-sum game mindset, which is that, if that reader buys that person's book, it means they're not buying my book. And there's the rising tide lifts all boats mindset. And I'm very much a proponent of the second one. And my favorite story about that is a year or so ago, I was at a book fair, or a book signing, a book event at a bookstore, and there were three of us sharing a table, all of whom wrote suspense, crime, mystery kind of books. And, we were having a nice time chatting with each other. And we realized that one of our books was, truly a very traditional mystery with a humorous twist. Mine was not really a mystery, but more suspense with a paranormal twist. And then the third person's was more of sort of a family dynamic story with a mystery underpinning. And so what we started doing is, when a reader would come over to the table, we would say, what kind of book do you like? And they would say, oh, I like this kind of book. And we as a group would say, oh, then you want Jane's book, or you want Kelly's book, or you want Maddie's book. And it was such a nice experience that I think we all sold more books than we would have if we had each been trying to grab on to each reader that came and sell them, sell our book. Right. And we not only benefited in that sense, but also benefit in the sense of all the goodwill we built up among the three of us, that we were all willing to sell each other's works.
But I think what's critical about that is you were focused on the person who approached you and what was the best book for them. So they left with the best possible book. So you probably sold more because you focused on the reader first. And I go back to David Gaughran. I think about the reader journey. Focus on the reader first, and therefore you were all more satisfied. You weren't competing with one another. And the reader who walked away most likely became a fan and probably bought more books of yours. So you weren't just selling a book. You were building relationships with each other, all three of you, satisfactorily made strong recommendations and stuff you actually believed. and then you made relationships with your ideal reader rather than the wrong reader, which is probably a really good long-term, really long-term. So you weren't just sailing for one day. You were
Yeah.
sailing off into the sunset magically with
Yeah. I
with
like
each other.
that.
And yeah. I'm trying to stick to the motif.
Absolutely. That's a great image.
So short tack then. We've teased that out. What does that mean? How does that apply to this wonderful book that we've written?
So as I was pinging all my friends who are boaters about terms that would include the word short, I think one of them eventually came up with short tack. And so I went to the internet and I started doing searches on what short tack means. And I actually pulled up a couple of quotes here because I like the explanation. So in the Wikipedia definition of short tack, it says to tack several times in rapid succession when sailing upwind in a narrow waterway. And in the book, we sort of talk about how the rapid release of short fiction can help an author make the most of the opportunities that are posed by the ever-changing winds of the marketplace. And another
analogy.
quote that I liked was, this was from a sailing instructor. He said, from a racing perspective, it is generally faster to make several short tacks over a distance of a race course, and here is why. While moving up the race course, a sailor has the opportunity to read and react to shifts. There are always wind shifts, no matter how small. And I think if you replace wind with market in that sentence, then you get a sense of how authors can test the waters of new opportunities using several short tacks rather than one larger work. And I'll
test the waters of new opportunities. Beautiful.
Yeah. And I'm going to share one more. This was from Sailing World. It says, if your engine dies one day and you can bet it will, the ability to short tack could be vital to know. And one of the other things we talk about is how authors can use short fiction to get unstuck on a longer work. So the more I read about what short tack meant, the more I saw that it was really perfect for the message we wanted to get out there.
Which is fantastic. And so in terms of the content of the book, because it's so well organized, we kind of approach it from multiple perspectives, right? Traditional publishing and self-publishing.
Yes.
But we also approach it from, as you just kind of said, it's not just about making money off short fiction, right? It's about using short fiction in multiple strategies, multiple ways for different outcomes, right? Like
yes.
Connecting with readers, kickstarting the muse, maybe, or whatever. How is it best for somebody to approach this book? Like, what are the expectations then? Is it for people who just want to figure it out? Is it people who are already writing short fiction?
I think it's definitely for people who are already writing short fiction and wonder what they can do with it.
Right.
But I think it's also for people who have only written longer fiction and maybe want to explore what the opportunities are that short fiction provides. And we have, as I mentioned, we have the section about creating income. We have the section about connecting with your readers. And then there's a section called best practices, which is the lessons we have learned as independent publishers about how to go about this. And we organize those in a separate section because they're really applicable across so many of the other ideas. Things like how to go about editing and proofreading for a short work. You can't necessarily, you don't want to sink the same money into a short story that you might for a novel length work. And so what are some options for achieving a professional level result without bankrupting yourself?
Yeah.
How to go about cover design. Similarly, links and QR codes, which is something that I learned from you, which was great. But we really start out with probably the most traditional way of getting your short work out there, which was the traditional publishing market. And that's really where I had to totally rely on you for advice, because that was just something I had not experienced at all. So do you want to talk a little bit about some high-level observations about that?
So I think what I find valuable in that is, because that's how I got my start, and I still do some traditional selling of my fiction, but I've changed my gambit. So when I started in the early days, it was payment and copy. You get a copy of the magazine, or then you'd start to make a little bit of money. I think my first actual pay was $5 for a story, And then there was the Science Fiction Writers of America have the pro rates, which was 5 or 6 cents a word, which is now 8 cents US per word. And so I remember getting to a certain point in my writing career where I refused to go with semi-pro or anything less than pro rates. I thought, okay, no, I'm a big enough name now where I'm a good enough writer. I don't need to sell for payment and copy or $25. I want pro rates. But I've changed my tack in that in the last
Change
few
your
years.
tack.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I've changed it in the last several years because I thought for me, we talked about editing, for example. When you sell your work to a market, when you're working with a good editor, they edit the work before it gets published. And that was one of the reasons why I felt confident enough to self-publish my book in 2004, because all the stories had been edited by someone and published. So they already were vetted and approved and whatever. But so let's say I don't get 8 cents per word. Let's say I get 3 cents per word, but I get it edited by somebody. So I'm getting a bit of money. I'm getting another credit. I'm getting the magazine or anthology that I'm in, and I'm getting it professionally edited. And there's a lot of anthologies I've been involved in lately are either charity anthologies where the money goes to a good cause, but it's being edited. And I've been in 2 anthologies in the last 6 months that were charity anthologies. One was a reprint, one was an original story. The reprint, it's probably the best edit it's ever had, and nothing against the original editor that edited it, but this new editor I had, took this story that's, been reprinted several times, and wow, she helped me make it even better. She drew stuff out of it, and I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. This is the best version of the story ever. And then the other one was a completely new story. And again, the editor helped make it better. And so, after, 6 months, 9 months, whatever the terms are of the contract, I've got this edited story that I did not have to pay out of pocket for. And in charity, obviously I didn't get money for it, but I got something personal out of it, knowing that it's for a good cause. Or in other cases, maybe I got some cash, but then I didn't have to lay out a lot of cash for the editor. So I get the best of both worlds. So that was something that would, as we were exploring that, I don't even think I mentioned it in my podcast. I think as we were exploring it in the book, that's one of the things we talked about.
Yeah, one of the messages that is very consistent through the book, one is more explicit and one is more implicit. The implicit one, I think, is the one you just discussed, which is with a single story and placing it in a single market or using it in a single way, you're gaining these benefits like you just mentioned with the editing. The other message that we're very explicit about is that one piece of fiction can keep earning you income or reader goodwill over and over and over again if you play your contractual cards right. And at the end, we found sort of the ultimate example of that with one of your stories where you went through every way you had used that story, from promotional to money making, and so you don't have to go to the book and pick one of the ideas that we've described. If you're careful about maintaining the rights to do so, you can pick many of the ideas that we laid out for a single piece of work.
Yeah, or even better yet, you see this idea and that idea, and you come up with your own hybrid merger of those two ideas, and it's your idea.
Yeah.
Because we just kind of went through a list of things, and I've found even often when I've done talks, I've had people come back to me a year or two later and say, "Oh, you said that thing, and then I did this," and they said, "Thank you for the idea." And I'm like, "I didn't give you the idea. You came up with it all on your own. Like you heard something I said, and it made you think about something. So when you added your chocolate to my peanut butter, you made something pretty awesome."
Yeah.
And I love when a reader could pick up a book like ours and say, "Okay, Maddie and Mark were throwing around peanut butter and chocolate, but we're going to mix it in different ways, in different variances to say, I'm going to use dark chocolate in mine, or I'm going to use organic peanut butter, or well, I'm going to use crunchy, like whatever." Yeah. Right. And to draw the analogy, I should have made that a nautical thing, but
but that one
I haven't
so
had
good.
breakfast. Peanut butter and chocolate are pretty appealing to me right now. But I think that's a value too, is when you take a resource like that, looking at, oh, cool, great ideas. I'm also going to take it even further with my own choices and my own path and things that are important to me as a writer.
Yeah, I think that in a year or so, I feel certain we'll be able to publish the second edition of this with ideas that I hope the readers will send us, and with
That would be
exactly
awesome.
those kind of new ideas.
Yeah, here's what I did. Here's what I took.
Yeah.
So the one other thing I wanted to talk about, because to me this is exciting. I've long said that the future of publishing is going to be more collaborative than ever before.
Mhm.
And I'm excited that we got to do this collaboration. I mean, think about how we connected and how, I don't believe we have ever hung out in person yet.
We have not. We've only hung out over Zoom.
Yeah, so Zoom, but we connected through common interests and common
Mhm.
goals and common aspirations as writers and indie publishing people. And then we did this project, but then the challenge we had was I didn't want to publish the book and then have to get the money and then pay it to you, or you don't want to publish the book and get the money and then have to pay it to me, because it just the tax issues and all that stuff is complicated.
Mhm.
Because it's different when it's going into your own business, but then you have to show the in and outs, and it that costs time and effort. So the way that we collaborated this and the way that we've published it, I think, is unique, and it's part of a beta program right now.
Yep.
But it allows us to do this without you get paid and I get paid. Nobody, just kind of don't have to go back and forth on it, right?
Yep.
We
Yeah.
want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll mention something else, and then I'm going to rely on you to talk about the other aspect, since it's very draft to digital centric. But one thing that we did that I think is vital is that we had a contract. And so it was just a couple of pages, and we emailed back and forth, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Fortunately, I don't think we disagreed about any of it, so it was quite easy. But
Yeah.
it was nice to have that in place. And there are certain things that we assumed when we went into it, like how we were going to split royalties or how the book was going to be branded, that turned out to change over time. And we both agreed, we looked at the contract and said, well, this isn't what we originally thought, but we both agree it's going to be different. And so
Yeah.
kind of on the side, I have this little one pager that says what things we changed in the process of doing the book, so that in a couple of years, when I look back and I say, wait, how come we didn't do that? I'll have a record of it. But that was very important, I think, to set the expectation, not only from the legal point of view, but from the expectation setting about what is going to come out of it. And then, as you said, the payment side, the royalty side was key. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that side.
Well, I want to go back to the contract and just talk about the importance. So yeah, sure, we get along, we agree on this. We're like, hey, this is fun. Let's work on this together. And it's kind of like you want to create a contract when you're both getting along and you're both on board, because there may come a time where we disagree or something might happen. Let's say, I don't know, for example, like movie rights come up and we both disagree on, oh, I want to sign the contract, you don't want to sign, whatever, right? There could be a disagreement.
Yep.
But we have a contract that even if we're not on friendly terms anymore, there's a contract that binds us to particular behavior, expectations, etc. And it wasn't complicated. It was like a one pager. And then again, because it was collaborative, when we made addendums and changes, we both agreed on them and just kind of tack it on as an appendix or whatever. So the other thing, because this is critical, and I've talked to Matt Buckman about this as well, is so this is your business and this is my business. And somebody else comes along and has to clean up the mess once my plane goes down, or I get hit by a bus, or I drown, I fall off the boat, and I get eaten by sharks. And the sharks are really those really bad people in publishing. But
that's a whole other podcast topic.
You mean I sign a really bad contract with a publisher? No, but in any case, I think that's important because somebody else comes along. My wife or your husband comes along and says, okay, now I got to figure out how to work with this other person. And there's an outline that says, this is the agreement, right? Where they can go, oh, okay. Mark's the co-author. The money's coming from draft to digital, and that's how it's being published. Therefore, if I have any questions about the money and stuff like that, it's a technical thing with D2D. If I have any questions about the ownership and the other agreement stuff that were mutually agreed upon, then I reach out to Mark, right? Like, so that I think that really helps clarify things for us, but it also could clarify it for our heirs.
Yeah. And there were times even during the production of the book where I would have a question and I couldn't remember, and I would go back to the contract and say, oh yeah, we had talked about this and that's fine. Oh, we had talked about this, but that seems weird now. Let me check in with Mark and see if we want to keep doing that.
Yeah, and I thought that was cool. So, in terms of the draft to digital and how this, I mean, so I have ties to draft to digital as a director of business development there, and I know that the D2D Universes is a program that was created as a way to allow authors who were using Kindle Worlds, where people can write in each other's universes and both make money off of it. And there are authors who it's been in a beta release, and there's authors that have been using it very beneficially. But knowing that universes require that collaboration aspect with payment splitting, we reached out to Tara, the operations director of operations there, and asked, well, I know it's not designed for this kind of collaboration, but is there a way to leverage this? Because I do know that that is something that D2D has on the development roadmap. And me being an insider, being able to communicate directly and say, here's what's working, here's what's not working, here's how we wanted it to work, here's how we had to adapt it, right? We had to do it a little bit differently. And we experimented. We're like, oh, so I have this in my account now, which is, someone went into the back end and created a relationship between us so that when one of us publishes the book, that the other one can see that it's a collaboration effort. So we saw the ways that it could work, but we also saw the ways that we had to, I guess, MacGyver it into a way that it's like not necessarily the way we imagined it when we talked about it, but I think it was a learning experience as an author. I think it's a good learning experience for draft to digital, because I think at the end of the day, we're going to have a tool that is satisfactory to meet the needs of what we need to do as writers, feeling confident that neither one of us has to worry about, cross-border tax issues, right? So I fill out a tax form as a Canadian with D2D, so I don't have to get the 30% withholding. If you were paying me, would you have to get me to fill out a tax form so that you wouldn't have to withhold 30%? You know what I mean? Like, so these are the weird issues we don't have to worry about because someone else is already taking care of that.
Yeah, in almost every case, I will trade a little bit of money or a little bit of something in order to be relieved of those kinds of administrative headaches and even legal headaches.
Right. Yeah, because we make 10% less rather than publishing direct to all the platforms.
Right.
But and we have a single source, right, of truth, single source of reports. And if there's a problem or we're doing price promos, it's not, okay, let's log into 16 places. Right.
Well, normally I am not a bleeding edge person. I'm a big believer in let somebody else experience the pain. And so another huge benefit I got from collaborating with you, not only is your great reputation and your reach in the publishing world, but also your contacts in draft to digital, because like when I went to set it up, I finally said, Mark, can you get on a Zoom meeting with me and do a screen share, because I want to make sure I'm filling it all in right. And there were a couple of places where I would have put the wrong thing. And you said, oh yeah, that is confusing. And you can get that word back to the people who might be able to impact that and help navigate those things that happen when something's being used in a somewhat experimental manner.
Yeah, I think that's the benefit. That's also the benefit too. So I look at this and say, okay, we're MacGyvering this process so we could do something, but this is something that I believe is valuable for writers and is going to be more valuable as more writers are able to collaborate better. What are the tools they need? How should it work for them? So I think by doing this experiment, we're mutually benefiting, but I think D2D is also helping, okay, so how is this going to help other writers? And I do know that there are other writers who are using it in beta and are providing feedback as just yet another point of reference. But again, because I'm internal, they can reach out to me and say, okay, go do this now. Right. Yeah. They have easier access to me. I could be sitting in the office one day when I'm visiting the office and actually show them my perspective as a writer. Well, this is how, and I do that all the time. I do videos of how I've done something to share with customer service to say, well, here's how I as an author use this tool. And they go, oh, okay. Right. So that's always a benefit too.
Yep, absolutely.
So the book is available for pre-order. It's coming out February 4th, 2020.
Yeah.
It's the ebook is up. The print book is still in process, I believe. Yes. We're still playing with the testing it to make sure it looks good and all those things, right?
Yes, the back end processing is happening.
Yeah. What are some final words that we want to say sort of about this project, about this collaboration, apart from teasing people that there may be future collaborations coming?
Yeah, yeah. Once the recording stops, I can pitch you my idea. And it'll be a little
Excellent.
secret for everybody.
Yeah, then we'll drag it on a little bit longer for people.
Yeah. I think in terms of taking the short tack, I'll just reiterate that the idea that it was a great learning experience for me in order for me to understand what I could do with my short fiction. It really runs the gamut of from more traditional approaches to really pretty cutting edge approaches, such as the location-based apps. I think something you've talked about earlier on your podcast about how you can use a short story and then bake it into a virtual walking tour. Well, an actual walking tour with a virtual guide, which is pretty neat. And I think that even more of those kind of ideas that seem very futuristic now in the next year or two are going to be very much within grasp. But one thing that really benefited me is that when we were working on all these ideas, my goal was to try as many of them as I could myself. And
Right.
so I actually wrote a short story specifically so I could submit it into the traditional publishing market to platforms that didn't accept reprints. I submitted a reprint. I still don't know what happened to that. And then I had this new story. And I was following the advice you had mentioned earlier about you might as well start at the top. You might as well start with the platforms that are paying pro rates. Why not? All they can say is say no. And went to the website, filled out all the metadata, hit submit. And this is like a big name magazine, and got an error, tried again, got another error, sent a note to a friend of mine who I know had submitted there. He said, oh yeah, they're pretty buggy. Try this other equivalent platform. I went, filled it. It was like the same form. I filled it all out, got exactly the same thing. No responses from customer service. And at that point, my indie authorness kicked in. And I said, this is crazy. Like, I'm not going to wait anymore for somebody to fix their stupid website so that I can submit my story. And I ended up publishing it as a standalone ebook. But it was cool to have gone through the process that I needed to in order to prepare it for submission. So that even though I didn't delve into the traditional publishing market, except for that one story that's still out there with a magazine as a reprint, I gave it the old college try. But there's a ton of learning there, a ton of ideas you can use, and you can pick and choose. You can find one that really works for you. I think there's a lot there for any person who's interested in fiction writing to benefit from.
That's cool. What I love about that is you talk about in the book, we talk about how you can use a short story to kickstart a longer project, or to get you back into something if you're blocked or whatever.
Yep.
You used our book to kickstart a short story.
Yeah, exactly.
So they can help both ways, right?
Yes, favorable wins all around. You know, you really can't go wrong. You're never gonna not benefit from exploring an idea. You're going to benefit in one way or the other.
Yeah, and I have to thank you, because one of the many benefits I got from this project, apart from a new collaboration, a different collaboration on different kind of nonfiction book, and very organized, of course, which is what I need, is the fact that you prompted me for the information for the podcast. Then we worked on this book together, and I know that not. I imagine that the book listed on Amazon probably has a bigger reach than my podcast. So the content that exists in audio for certain people who prefer to get it in audio content is there for the podcast. It's free. You helped me take that idea and expand it into something so much bigger, and also in a different context where people could read it. And yes, there will be an audio version of it out eventually as we get that together. So there will be an audio version that people can buy, but you helped expand this idea. And now the possibility that more writers will have the benefit or the opportunity to learn in the way they prefer, to read it in print, to read it in ebook, to listen to the audiobook, rather than, oh, I got to go and listen to episode 102 of the podcast. No, I don't do podcasts, but I like books. Yeah. So I love the fact that suddenly this intellectual property, this idea, this concept is now available in even more formats for people to enjoy in multiple ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a podcast person. I enjoy listening to podcasts, but then I like having a book that if I say to myself, oh, what did he say about, the idea of location-based apps? I can just flip to it and remind myself about that. So
exactly.
I use different formats for different needs.
Well, Maddie, thanks for collaborating with me on the book, and thanks for collaborating with me on this episode.
Yes, thank you for having me as a guest and for being a guest on this episode.
I wanted to reflect on something that Maddie said, and this is when she was talking about the terminology and why she chose the title Taking the Short Tack and why the nautical references were so important to her. She talked about tacking as that activity that a sailor will engage in when they need to move, particularly through changing environments, changing wind, changing water flow, things like that. Now, again, I'm not a sailor, so I don't understand that. But one of the things she did say was related to the indie author experience, or even the author experience in general, is that change in conditions as you're moving, as you're sailing, and taking the short tack, meaning there are going to be long-term changes. There's going to be long-term things that you do, but sometimes there's short things you can do. And she talked about testing market conditions and using short fiction, for example, to test that. But one of the things I wanted to come back to is there are those short-term things, and there's tactics that you can use, but then there's long-term strategies. And one of the things that's really, really critical for you to remember is that there will always be changes. I've been in the industry since 1992, and I've seen trends go up and come down. I've seen new technologies come in and become exciting new platforms for people. I've seen things disappear. So the one thing to remember is it's good and it's valuable to understand the market and the conditions of where you are now, but it's also good to think about your writing and your career in the long term. And when change happens, what are the things you can do to roll with the changes? We know what sailors do. They do that tack, and that helps them feel things out. That helps them understand what's going on. Now, if anyone in the audience is a sailor, please comment over on this episode on starkreflections.ca and say, Mark, you got it all wrong. Because I'd love to understand that. But at least my perception and the way I understand it is, surviving in the short term by those things that you have to do and testing the market conditions, testing the waters of publishing, and then looking at the long term and looking at the goal, like looking at the horizon and where you need to be next, and even sometimes understanding what's going to be on that horizon. What did you find interesting or something to reflect on from this conversation with Maddie and the new book that's coming out February 4th, 2020? You can leave those comments over at starkreflections.ca for episode 116. I hope you found value in this podcast. If you did find value in this podcast, what you can do to help me is you can share it with a friend that you think would find value in these reflections. So until next week, and next episode, which is episode 117, and it is going to be another episode about collaboration between two authors with a new genre and their collaboration with a professional audiobook narrator. That will be next week, which will be coming out on Friday, January 31st. So until next episode and next week, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.